Hello, and welcome to the Game Dev Local Podcast. I'm Nina Kim, and today I'll be talking with Brendan Walker. Hello,
Hello.
Brendan.
Hello. How's it
I hope
going?
it's going well. How are you doing today?
Doing good. Doing good. Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, thank you for joining us. To start off, would you like to introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yeah. So, my name is Brendan Walker. I'm currently an engineer here at Polyarc Games. Been at Polyarc for, coming up almost on 10 years now, which is crazy to think about. We do VR games as our primary focus. The one that we're known most for is probably Moss, which is a puzzle adventure game. We did Moss 1 and Moss 2. Before that, I've been an AI engineer. I worked at Bungie for a few years on Destiny as an engineer there, character engineer there, Destiny 2, Halo, Reach, and a little bit of Halo ODST. And then before that was in the casual games industry. Actually, between that was a pirate MMO called Pirates of the Burning Sea. And then before that, some casual game stuff. So I've been in industry since about, 2003. I'm old.
If you're old, then I'm old.
Yeah.
so, but I like it. I'm like ready to be old.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So actually, I'm curious. So you had like a wide range of experience, like from different types of studios. What has been the like main difference you felt like working in
Mm,
an indie studio compared to the
mm.
others?
That's a great question. I'm really glad you asked that. Um, I think that for me, it's been the amount of specialization and communication friction. And these are both. I don't know. Can you frame communication friction as a good thing? For me, it started off, doing a startup with friends out of college, and very small, tight knit group. It's which spun out of people trying to do a student project that became a game company, and then for a while, it's more casual game companies, and even on the pirate MMO, you think of an MMO as being a big company, but that studio was only at max 80 people. So for a long time, it was a small, tight knit group. Whereas Bungie started small and then grew to be, I think when I started there it was 115, and when I left it was like 600, and they since have gone much larger than that size. Um, so in small teams, I feel like you get the good and bad thing, and mostly good, I think, of wearing multiple hats. You feel like there's a lot of there's like a lot of problems to solve, and everybody needs to jump in and try to fix what they can. And there's a lot of handoff and switching between different roles. And I think I find that a lot of fun. I really, as an engineer, enjoy firefighting. I enjoy working in strike teams. We have like a small group, like, hey, we have a specific like sub area of the game we're trying to solve, and that's like creatively riff. It's a little like game jamming in a way, but usually it's like on a specific sub problem, and I love it. And that's what that I think gives me the most like creative fulfillment. Um, but one of the consequences of being doing like a lot of firefighting and jumping between a lot of different subject areas is that often you don't get as much specialization in a specific area. You don't get like really good at AI. You don't get really good at doing some deep level system thing, or really deep at rendering. Um, and so depending on what your goals, if you wanted to get like really good or really specialized at a particular skill set, sometimes it can be more difficult. Not to say that it can never happen. Some people choose like, no, this is what I'm going to focus on in a small studio, and they get to do that. um, some small studios I've been at, that people are like, no, I'm the engine guy and I'm just going to work on the engine and this is my thing, and they'll hold on to that. But and so for a long time, early in my career, it was kind of jumping around at a bunch of small areas. And then at Bungie, um, they started off kind of very small strike team stuff, but it was more specific and character focused. And then as the company grew, it started becoming more hyper focused on the AI knowledge systems, like what's the awareness of the environment and like pathfinding and stuff. And it's not in big companies, I don't think, that anybody generally tries to force you to be very specialized. It's just that once you start getting good at an area and the product is big enough, you're like, well, you're the domain expert. So like, clearly you're the person you should keep, working at. And so you sort of just end up sliding into being that specialist. And you actually have to make a conscious effort to like switch gears later, and it's kind of funny because it's easy to become comfortable being the thing. Like, it feels good to be like knowledgeable about an area and be able to answer questions about it. And then it's suddenly when you're like, somebody's like, hey, can you help out this other thing? I'm like, well, I don't know that, so you sort of like inadvertently funnel yourself into that narrow specialization. So I found myself near the end of my time there, becoming, I realized like I'm like too hyper focused here. I feel like I'm not growing, in other areas, and I missed that feeling of, uh, you know, jumping around. And then the communication burden, half of it relates to just as you get more and more people working on the same project, it's just really hard to come to consensus on things. And in every system, it depends on the kind of game you're doing. But if you have like a sandboxy game, where a lot of systems affect a lot of other systems, or systems affect a narrative, or what kind of characters you're going to need, you start needing like handoff. And like one of the last things I was working on there was on this like scripting tool for some of the cinematics that's supposed to be like blend into the gameplay. And everything we did what was going to touch everything else. And so it was like, you're in trouble when you're like, you have meetings to plan for future meetings, rather than just like solving a problem. Like, well, we need to figure out, this other meeting to talk to, who we're going to talk to for this other group. And so it was like a year of planning. And I'm like, I hate this. Can we just work on the thing? I just want to make features. And then, because we don't know if any of this is going to be right. Like, you can make this grand plan, and then it's still not going to work. For me, it was refreshing after, and I don't want to say like I'm Duncan and Bungie. Like, I think it's a great company, and I learned a ton there. I think any really big company where we have a lot of people working at big projects is going to have this problem. It's just a difference. So for me, being able to work on small stuff again, I feel like is where I prefer to operate, and working on team sizes where you've got 20-ish people. There's no magic number, but I feel like there's some 5 to 25 people feels good. You can riff on those kind of small jams. So
I
anyway,
feel
yeah,
like
that's what I feel.
there's a magic range.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I definitely feel the same way. Like, I like smaller teams, and communication at a bigger studio has been a struggle, I think, especially when it comes to remote work.
Mm,
Um, the bigger the team, I found the harder it was to communicate and keep everything cohesive in the project,
mm-hmm,
because
mm-hmm.
everyone's working on different things, and if they don't communicate, then the project falls apart.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I don't know if you've ever heard of a funny term. I don't know if it's just been debunked or not, but the idea kind of appealed to me. It's called Dunbar's number. It was like this idea of like this person who's studying like gorilla tribes or whatever knows that like they only had the ability to empathize with like a finite number of other apes. And they think it's like maybe humans have that same number. They feel like it's like around like 115, and it's not that you can't visualize or conceive of more than that number of people in your head, but it just becomes more difficult for you to like empathize with a group bigger than that. That's why we end up having to form like hierarchies and large groups for communicating. It's like for me, it's just right. It's like it's not that it's impossible. It just becomes very difficult to like keep the needs and wants and feelings of more than that people past a certain size. And you have to like work really hard at it. And so
Yeah,
maybe it's still
definitely.
laziness on my part. I like small groups.
I it's been really nice to see how hierarchy works, like, in like as a benefit, and
Mm,
kind of
mm-hmm,
like, if you don't have like the right people leading, or the right people who are like that glue, then
mm-hmm,
it could easily fall apart, because it is hard to like keep everything organized and like running smoothly when there isn't that glue, or there aren't the right people in the right roles. But yeah, that
mm.
was a great answer. It's actually not an answer that I've heard a lot of,
Oh,
interestingly
mm.
enough. Yeah, so that's great. Um, so you've been working at an indie VR studio. I want to hear about how you have seen the indie VR space, or just the VR space in general, change over the last 10 years.
Yeah, boy, it has been interesting, and it's weird thinking about it being a 10-year-old thing now. Because for me, in my head, there's part of me that still thinks of it as this nascent thing. Like it's still new, but it's really not, right? Like this is where you could make an argument, and, like is Moss One a retro VR game now? I don't know. Well, I'm sure what that threshold is, but um, yeah, I think when it started, it was very much in the VR is this magical, mysterious thing. Everybody who put on a headset was like, "Oh my god, this is amazing!" Mind blowing. And it was, could be for the simplest thing, like you're walking around a box in a room. All of the hardware, early on, was super clunky. Funny is when we first were starting, we were very much in startup mode, as everybody was, because like it was just a bunch of startups doing the thing. There was no game studios because there was no publishing for it. So you were getting, venture capital, or if you were lucky, a hardware producer was maybe giving you some money to make demos. And so in our small office space, we were lucky enough to get our hands on one of the earlier Vive dev kits. And the other's still very much working on. We didn't get like the really crazy early like 3D printed ones, like from the guys who did Job Simulator. They were like 3D printed masks, and you couldn't like touch certain parts, you get shocked. And but in our case, ours weren't quite those rough, but like they were still not the production ones, and they had problems with like the lighthouses with the lasers would reflect off of certain metal surfaces. So we were renting this office space that was technically like the storage for the nearby like accounting firm, and they need to come in occasionally get access to the file cabinet, but the file cabinet screwed up the tracking, so we'd have to like tape cardboard over it every time they'd come over to get the files. You have to rip the cardboard back off. And so like anyway, a lot of in that early day, it was like just trying to figure out like, what can you do in the space? What does it mean now to have your hands in the space and start interacting with it? And so it was a lot of early prototyping, simple like device interactions, and like what feels good. How can you? One of the biggest things was like, how can you make for us? How you make an object feel like it has mass? Because like you can't make the controller feel heavier. And so what are some tricks you can do to like make it feel like you're picking something up? There was no hand tracking in those days, and so you just had the control. And so what do you do when like your hand physically can push through something, but the controller, the representation of the control in the world is stuck to an object? So it was a lot of early kind of fun experimenting and playing around with that, but a lot of it was like very simple demo-ish stuff. And there was always sort of this promise that we would pitch to people about like, well, right now the hardware is clunky. Right now it's expensive. You have to have a big, powerful PC to run it. You have to have these, clunky wires, that are attached to the thing. You had wires to the controllers. You had the wire to the big clunky wire to the headset, to the back to the PC. Weighed a lot. So there's this promise like one day this is, all of these wires are going to disappear, and you're just going to have this simple lightweight device, and it's going to be affordable. And so fast forward to now, and surprisingly, we have that. You look at all of the modern VR headsets, and they're there. You have a lightweight self-contained device, and granted, it's not as powerful as a PC, but it's still pretty dang good for what it is. It's a mobile chipset, but it's a good mobile chipset. And you have good controllers with the responsive tracking, and some mature development tools. So and we're still here, which surprised me. I sort of thought that at this point, 10 years on, if you asked me where we would be, we would either have completely failed. At that point, we would have been like the third failed VR wave, or we'd be stable, like like another console, like a game console. It'd be like an Xbox, and there'd be tens of millions of people playing, and like a healthy ecosystem of games. And we're somewhere in between those two. We're like we've been stuck in this perpetually uncomfortable zone where we haven't died. Like there's still hardware being made, there's still games being made. There's definitely more of an audience than there's ever been. Hovering around between that 5 and 10 million range, but it hasn't like blown up to be like stable, either. And so I'm kind of, for me, it's a little frustrating, because I'm happy to still, be gainfully employed. I'm happy to still be making games, but like, there's a number of reasons we can get into, that in a separate topic if you like, about like, why is that? Why are we stuck in this weird, uncomfortable zone? Like I've seen this incredible growth. The technology has proven there's still plenty more to be done, but and there's consolidation in the industry is a big thing. There's other players and whatever is sort of a field day now. It's sort of consolidated to really two or three, depending on how you want to quantify that. So yeah, it's been interesting. I feel like in general we're sort of left in this like it should be more stable than it is, and so you're sort of left wondering like where
Yeah,
is this going in the next 5?
it's so interesting to hear from you as a developer and your perspective, and then to think about it as a player.
Mm-hmm,
Because
mm-hmm,
I remember like back when I first tried it, I was using the headset with the wires, and I would trip over it, and
mm-hmm,
like my glasses were in the way and everything would fog up, and
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
but even then it was pretty impressive. But I remember back then I had some doubts. I was like, "Oh, I don't
mm-hmm,
know. VR, it's like so like inconvenient." And they're like, and I didn't think it was actually going to go anywhere. But to my surprise, it actually improved quite a bit. So that kind of lined up with what you were saying. Like everything, like the hardware got better, like the games that were available were more varied and pretty impressive when it came to experiences. There was some some games that like had like a space where you're up high, and it
Hmm.
actually like made me more afraid of heights.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, this is it's so and I think it made me more see more of the potential of VR. Like before it was like, yeah, but we're never gonna get there. And now it's more like, um, yes, the headsets are more affordable now, but it's still like kind of like not my go-to
Hmm.
because
Hmm.
there's other consoles. There's
Hmm.
so many games. Like I'm gonna go for convenience because life is so
Hmm.
difficult,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
I'm clumsy and I'll run into stuff. But like I never want to let go of VR. I don't want VR to die because there's so much potential in the games that you can get in VR and the experiences you can have that you just can't have in like outside of VR. So
Yeah.
it kind of lines up with what you're saying there, whereas it's not like all the way, but it's somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and yeah, to add to that, because I think you touched on two really important points there. One is the friction thing. The friction's lower than it's ever been, and it's still not low enough. And it's really a combination of two things, right? It is so easy, and people's Steam backlog is so huge. It's so
yes,
easy to buy. It's never been easier to buy games right now. There's so many, and it's so easy to start playing on the PC. Um, that the value proposition for a VR headset is tricky, right? Because it's definitely way simpler and easier to slap on a Quest headset, but um, it's still a little bit, of effort to get into it. You still have to clear, your messy living room, right? You still have to, dust off the headset if you haven't been using it in a while. You have to, do the firmware update. There's got to be enough games on the platform for it to be interesting to keep you like what is the core loop of stuff. There's more games on the Quest than there have been, or on VR headsets, but it's not. It pales in comparison to what's available on PC gaming, right? And so having that proposition is tricky. And then yeah, you mentioned like the lens fogging. That's still a thing that happens, right? Especially if you're playing like an action game, um, and uh, and despite the weight of the headsets being lighter than they've ever been, over time it's still fatiguing.
yeah,
Over eyes in separate, even the weight, even though it's better than it's ever been, it still exists, and so there's still work to do, to make that, and they continue to do that. So yeah, it's hard. It's like it's 10 years on. It's come an incredible distance, but I feel like the consumer tolerance has also like gotten harder faster than the hardware has like improved. It's improving, but like consumer expectations growing, just steeper curve. If that makes sense.
yeah.
So yeah, there's both of those challenges there. Oh, and then something else that's super interesting too. About the market changing is when we started, we were really, really concerned about trying to make games as comfortable as possible because it's really easy to make experiences that can make you nauseous whenever you're seeing motion in the camera that's not induced by the player if you're on a roller coaster or using thumbstick locomotion. So Moss was a game about being in dioramas where you're seated, and when you move around, it's only your head that's moving, and everything's within arm's reach. And our assumption being that like most people who can afford to play VR are adults with disposable income, and if kids want to play, we want to make a game that thematically is appropriate, and that they'll enjoy. But that we thought like people who are going to be, generally speaking, older people tend to have more motion sickness issues, and so trying to make a game that is accessible to that, we felt like that was going to be the majority of the market. But over time, really, that shifted as the commodity headsets become like in 2 or 3 years ago, where you started seeing Quests show up in Costco, right? And people were buying them for Christmas, and Gorilla Tag became the thing. And that's a game where it's like all your locomotion, motion stuff is out the window. Your monkeys throwing themselves around the world, and kids don't have that problem. They quickly, and there's an element too of you can overcome motion sickness by being immersed in the space. And I don't mean like the world looks like quality, but just you are engaged. You are excited. There's something that is drawing your attention to the space. And sometimes the combination of social mechanics, playing with your friends, or just being in an environment that's fun. And kids will just throw themselves, into that. And so suddenly the market, I feel like somewhere in the last 5 years started skewing from being like mostly adults to now more kids. And so what does that do for your market? Because it's still the case that like adults get sick, or can, they tend to be. And so what do you make your game for? Do you try to design to be like comfortable, or do you have one that's like more locomotion intense? And that's been a challenge too.
Yeah, I can imagine. I actually, yeah, I see a lot of kids playing with VR headsets now. I remember I was talking to this 12-year-old and he was like, try this game. And I put the headset on and I immediately wanted to barf.
Yeah, I really understand.
But, but like, I think there's still a want there. Like maybe
Hmm.
it's just that like you keep trying to make the stuff or like a good balance of stuff until you can figure out like how to make it better for people.
Hmm. Hmm.
But I don't even know if that's possible. Like we still get motion sickness like in cars and that
Hmm.
sort of thing and we haven't come up with a foolproof solution. So
Yeah, yeah,
I
and I
imagine it's
will.
always going to be
Yeah.
there. Yeah.
Yeah, I will say, it's interesting. Sorry, I don't want to like. I can talk for endlessly about VR stuff. There's other questions I want to get to, but yeah, to specifically the point, can you make locomotion intense games that help file off the rough edges of discomfort? Yes, there's definitely stuff that can be done. And you've seen any Batman Arkham Asylum gameplay? They have. It's a game that when I first saw the pitch for, I'm like, this is totally going to make me sick because you're using the grappling hook to like grab onto random tether points and zip around the environment. But there's a lot of really cool stuff they did to file off the edges there. Moving linearly through the space, doing a lot of vignetting on your periphery to cut out the sharp motion stuff. Having darker spaces sometimes help with like flatter texturing can help. So you have a lot of like high detail noise in your periphery that can make you sick. Good sound effect usage, having good when you land in anticipation of the land, good sound effects and other stuff like that. Anything that can tell your brain like when you're gonna crash into something and that you just like do like a hard stop, you have that moment of like it's like falling off a bike. If you don't have
Yeah.
something to tell your brain like it's okay, you're coming in for a soft landing, that's really ooh. um and so there's a lot of stuff that can be done in that, but it's not perfect and it takes time to iterate on that, and it's game specific for sure.
It's so fun to learn about that kind of stuff because some of it I don't even think is just VR specific. It's just like the
Mm.
psychology of the mind, and
Mm-hmm.
it's pretty cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Um,
yeah. To the point, like priming is a fun example where you like if do either a sound hook or something like that to like tell the brain like, hey, this thing's about to happen, and you do it enough times. And that's applicable outside of VR, right? Like
yeah,
just for
a
real.
lot of
Yeah.
the stuff I kind of learned from you with the whole like in VR simulating weight to something.
Mm,
It's hearing about that. I was like, oh, that's actually something I could use outside of VR,
absolutely,
like because
absolutely.
there's a lot of like tactility in games outside of VR, and it just adds to like the whole immersion of the game. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot we could learn from VR as
Yeah.
well. So it's great. I wanted to ask you because you talked about all of the, kind of hardships of like uh, how VR isn't like all the way up there, but it's somewhere in the middle. So tell me, how has it been trying to survive as indie VR
Yeah,
studio?
great question. So yeah, and it's been a tricky couple of years because the first five, first it was just trying to get kind of that startup-y fundraising, got some of that, but tight but possible. And then you had the support of a couple of hardware vendors trying to like sell VR headsets, and so they were much more willing to help fund stuff. So Sony was a huge partner for a long time in PlayStation VR and PlayStation VR 2. They helped make Moss 1 and Moss 2 possible. And then shortly thereafter, around kind of the same time, overlapping, Oculus and Meta helping with the Quest, was trying very hard to help partners get onto the Quest headset, and both helping with the publishing side, helping with testing was huge. Just trying to constantly get feedback about what could be made better with the system. So like in that, there was kind of a sweet spot from that year 2 to year 5 where we were getting a lot of support from the vendors, and Valve too. Valve was a huge support early on, trying to just get people. Their big thing was either like helping give you access to just VR hardware where it was originally hard to get, so you could test on it early, and trying to help make it easier to be on the store. Either offering kind of effectively grants or advances on royalties or just like good ad placement for the thing. So there's kind of that support early on. And there was kind of that golden age, early on. You still couldn't do anything big, right? Like there wasn't like tons of money flowing in, but it was enough to be, if you were a small team of like 5 to 20-ish people, you could sustain a small studio off of that. And it was tight, but it was stable. And then that kind of initial honeymoon period kind of was starting to fade off a little bit, and there was some consolidation. And then there's kind of this other golden period where, specifically with the Quest, is the pandemic, happened, and there was post Costco like putting headsets out there that kind of caused this unexpected large increase in people that were buying stuff, because there's like not a ton to play, but some to play on the Quest. And so suddenly like games that had kind of already gone over their big sale hump on prior VR kind of got a second resurgence again, and that helped a little bit. But then, more recently, just everybody has been hurting this last 2 or 3 years in games across the board. Just less funding, publishers drying up, the rebounding due to inflation, causing less consumer demand. More recently, on the MetaQuest story, they talked about they've been doing some changes to how they've been trying to kind of incentivize more people to use Meta Horizons, their kind of game platform, but it's had an adverse effect on sales. And there's there's been huge drops across the board on sales, people, just because of visibility, discoverability. And this isn't like private, but like they've talked about this. There is a blog post about how they're trying to address this right now. And so, yeah, it was a really hard year for us. And so for, us at Polyarc, 2 years ago, we were kind of in a scary position, and we were looking at, pay cuts and like, we were gonna have to lay anybody off. We were incredibly fortunate at that time, though. That was when Meta was trying to get Batman Arkham Asylum out the door. And they had a ton, it was a huge project, and they really wanted this game that was going to kind of be front and center for the MetaQuest 3 launch. And they wanted this to be like the big thing for it, but they had a ton of work to do. And so we were in a tight spot, and like they needed a bunch of people to help out. And they had a bunch of, it wasn't just us. There was several studios actually from England as well, all over the world trying to help out. So about 10 of us went over there. And so for about the last 9 months, we were just there kind of helping them with a bunch of design, bug fixing and tweaks. And I was doing a bunch of perf optimization and stuff for them. So it was really cool. It was a cool opportunity, both just to see how a big company does a VR project. We were in Unity, so our Polyarc, we're all in Unreal, and so it was interesting switching back to Unity again, and like working on a game, like a big game in Unity and VR was an interesting experience. And so
I want to hear about that.
yeah, definitely. I'll talk more about that too. So yeah, but then fortunately, so that kind of tied us over. And then things have started looking up again. We'd had before, just before Batman, there's another game that we had started working on, a free-to-play game based on the Moss universe called Glassbreakers. That is going to be the same rodent characters, but a head-to-head match. And we were debating about, do we go? We didn't have enough funding to make like a full a full game, but like, we do like a smaller free-to-play competitive game. And we just like started putting out a beta, and we're trying it out, and we're like, there's interest here, but it's like we're like 2 orders of magnitude short the number of players we need, both combination of just not being enough free-to-play users at the time on the platform, and also there was just a lot of apprehension that VR players had. So like, hey, I want a traditional VR game experience where I'm purchasing a full game and I'm not getting nickel and dimed, and there's a lot of apprehension about it. So we're like, this isn't going to work. We need to put this on ice and then come back to it. And so fortunately, since after Batman shipped, we've been able to get funding for that and continue working on that, and porting that to some new platforms, working on hand tracking as compared to just controllers, which has been really interesting. And then there's we got funding for a separate new project that hasn't been announced yet, but I'm very excited about. So finally things are starting to look up. But yeah, it's been dicey for everybody. I feel incredibly, I think it's supremely lucky unfortunate that we get to continue doing gaming, making games in general anyway, because it has been hard across the board. But also in VR, it's such a tightrope walk. So.
Yeah. But you have all this unique knowledge, though. I don't actually know that many VR developers, and it seems like you get to experiment a lot and kind of pave the way,
Mm-hmm.
which is really nice. Yeah. Um, I wanted to hear a little bit more about how the differences between developing in Unreal for VR and developing in Unity for VR, because I actually
Mm-hmm.
don't know what those
Mm-hmm.
differences are like. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean they're both pretty mature tool sets at this point. I would say the biggest challenge and the fear that comes with in Unreal, you've got it's written in C++, which means that and you have, more importantly, it's not the language that's the important part. The important part is that you have full source code for it, which means that if there's a problem, and usually it's like specifically it's like a perf issue, because in VR you need to run at a minimum of 72 frames per second on the Quest, and on PC it's higher, like 90. If you drop below that, people start getting sick because it's just you start feeling that stutteriness. Um, and it's really, 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 really easy to fall below frame rate due to having loading hitches, for like a new shader that popped up, or transitioning levels, particularly if you're doing an open world game where you can walk freely and you don't. If you make the design decision to not have loading screens, that makes your life so much harder, which is the case in Batman. And so and because you have full source code in Unreal, it means that you can profile to the bottom, and then you can fix it if you need to. In Unity, they written in C#, and I think the language is more pleasant to work with, and the iteration is faster. In Unreal, if you're making a C++ code change, it takes a little bit to like wait. Like that feedback loop is like 5 minutes to like try something out. In Unity, it's instant, right? You're making a quick C# change and trying it out, and that's great. But if you're unfortunate enough to hit some random perf issue, then it can be a lot harder to fix. And this is something that came up a lot in Batman. Spawning characters they had really complicated characters. They had a lot of like cinematic characters that these guys need to like load in, have facial animation, or be involved in cinematic cutscenes or whatever. And so character load happens, and it's like, hey, this takes 150 milliseconds to load the character. That seems fine, right? Like 150 doesn't seem that bad in a normal game. But it turns out in a VR game where each game frame is 13 milliseconds, it's like, it's like 10 frames to load the character. You can't block, what do you do? And some of that stuff, there's things like, that you can do to optimize stuff and split stuff across frames or whatever. But some stuff, we hit a number of issues in Unity where it's like just loading the character animations for this causes this like, 8 millisecond hitch, and that's like 75% of the game frame, and I can't do anything. We had Unity engineers come in to try to help give some suggestions, and there's some
Oh,
tomfoolery we
wow.
could do, but it was just really hard. And on the Batman team, they were fortunate enough to afford the license for at least having access to the source code. So like at least then we could like point to like, hey, this is causing it. But even just getting code change is just hard for that. So it just trade-offs, right? Like on one hand, Unity, great iteration, super fast to iterate on game features, which is huge. I don't think they could have, for the kind of game they're doing, necessarily done that in Unreal, because they had so many different kinds of interactions in that game. Because it's Batman, you have all these devices and stuff. You have the grapple gun, you have explosive gel, you have all these other character takedowns and combos and stuff. And so they had the ability to like iterate, constantly all the way up into the end. They were making constant tests and trials and stuff. And I think it would have been harder to do. You can do it in Unreal, but I think with the Blueprint visual scripting stuff, it kind of accomplishes some of that, but it's I think it would have been harder. But yeah, God, the perf optimization stuff was such a challenge. And so for us, because we've had smaller scope games at PolyArc, for us, Unreal's been our preferred engine, and being able to make those core optimizations when we need to. And yeah, the visual scripting one is kind of another interesting one too. And Unity does have a Bolt as a new visual scripting tool, which is really cool. But it does feel like it's a generation behind the Blueprint visual scripting that's in Unreal. Like it's not, a lot of the same features exist, but it just doesn't feel like it's had like that second, because like Unreal, they had to have what they call Blueprint now was called Kismet in Unreal 3, and was definitely rough and janky a long time. So they had that chance to like rewrite chunks of it and have the next version of it. So Um,
It's
yeah,
just
so I wouldn't say like one's better or worse than the other. It's just, the strengths and
is that
weaknesses.
related to your love-hate relationship with the visual scripting?
We Yeah, so so this is also interesting too, right? Because before, um, because this really gets to a game iteration thing with designers and stuff, and the relationship between designers and programmers and artists and programmers. Um, but back at Bungie, and it's kind of, when we're trying to do this scripting tool, it was really going to be a visual scripting tool for sequencing for in-game cinematics and stuff. Um, and I used to think like, that visual scripting isn't a good tool for game development. I don't feel this way anymore, but at the time, like this isn't a good tool because it's great for doing small little sandboxy things, like toy box things. But the moment you try to do any real, feature, you now are left with like it's too cumbersome to like scroll through all these nodes. You don't have all of like the deep software engineering tools and the debuggers and things like that engineers are used to using, and so you're stuck trying to make a game with like worse tools that feel more clumsy. That was the opinion that I had at the time. But when we started at Polyarc, switched to Unreal and started using Blueprint, and a couple things that I came to appreciate. The first is that um, often a lot of little small game features or interactions are small toy box things, and that you don't need it. But Bungie and other big studios where an engineer had to make the feature first, the engineer was the bottleneck. And it just would slow down the ability for somebody to like, I just want to try this out. Does this interaction feel good? If I want to go and boop this plant and have it play this little particle effect or whatever, but this thing doesn't need, so I need to like file a feature for an engineer to get the thing, and then like a month later they get a thing back and they can actually try it, and they're like, we cut the plants, you know. But in like a visual scripting thing, it's like, yeah, it's messy or whatever, it's a simple thing, but who cares? Like, they can just try it, and I don't need to be the bottleneck for that, and that's hugely empowering. And I think the other thing that I saw, it was really cool. It's so many other studios. There was this opinion that like designers shouldn't touch code, artists shouldn't touch code, engineers touch code. And we're the ones that need to keep an eye on that. And there are different circumstances where like why you need to make sure that there's somebody shepherding the process and making sure that like you don't have chaos. If you're like everybody's touching everything, but I think it's hugely empowering to let people branch out and try that. And so like you can be a programmer and you can create new features and try stuff, and I think that's really important. And I think it's important for artists and designers to feel like they have the ability to iterate and add features and experiment with things like that. And so when I saw that, I'm like, oh, that's great, I love that. It is still then the responsibility of the engineer to say like, okay, I see you've now made this rat's nest, and that's okay. But now we've shown like this is a thing we want. Here's a couple of parts out of this thing that I can help take and systematize and clean up. And that's so much better, because I can't tell you how many times in my career I've tried to preemptively make the system thing. I'm like, this is what you need. And then it's totally not what they need. Stuff gets repurposed for stuff that you didn't intend. One of the funniest examples for me of that was I had made this simple tool for like a cinematic state machine for characters in the tower industry, for like the sweeping guys, like you guys playing idle animations or shop merchant animations, like cycling a couple stuff. And that ended up getting repurposed for one of the major raid bosses in there, because they needed the thing. The other feature didn't exist. Yeah, actually, this is better. There's another boss they wanted to have. Like, he started off with his hands like chained to these like chains on the ground that were connected to his arms. And they didn't have a feature with that, but somebody else realized like, well, wait, we already have this IK tool for steering when you're in a car, where your hands are attached to the steering wheel. So that boss was actually in a vehicle that was on the ground. The steering wheel was the chains,
That's so great.
Yeah, right. And so, yeah, that's I always joke about, like a horse's pants in games. um, and so anyway, the point being that I think it's you're always going to get the system wrong if you're trying to design it front. It's better to let the designer, try to prototype it first and then go back and clean it up, later. And so that's what I love about it. The hate part, it's specific to Unreal, is that it's very, very, very easy when you're using visual scripting to have content dependencies that you inadvertently like, hey, this blueprint casts this other blueprint, and you don't realize when you do that you pull in, you have to load that dependent asset, and it's easy to make this loading spider web, and suddenly when you go to launch the game, you've loaded the entire game. This was a problem in MOS 1 that we never fixed. Like, when you're on the menu, you load the whole game in the background. It didn't matter because the game wasn't that big, but like, it's really easy to fall into that trap. So but
Yeah,
I still love it
that
more
makes
than hate
a
it.
lot of it makes a lot of sense. I totally saw instances of both of those things. But as a designer, yeah, blueprints are definitely a really good prototyping tool.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, I can completely understand your love-hate
Yeah.
relationship. Although I guess I'm more on the love side because I'm
Hmm.
the designer making rat's nest.
Hmm.
Um, so, um, you mentioned uh, like working at Polyarc, there were some like kind of pivots and like cancellation of projects. What was that like? How like what happened there? And is there anything you would have done differently? And
Hmm.
yeah, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, yeah. So we had in the interim period, there was a brief opportunity after Moss 1 before Moss 2, where we approached our partner about trying to do another kind of arcadey game, and we were like, hey, can we take on like more aggressive locomotion in a way that still feels comfortable? It was kind of more of a racing game. We were moving along some like roadways, and you had to be like a jetpack, and you could like jump off ramps and things. And you had a little flying companion that accompanied you. Um, and uh though it didn't start with the roads, actually became well, anyway. Yeah, so we the goals were trying to like make more interesting like hand interactions and more interesting intense locomotion. But we were at that point, we're still pretty small studio, and we're still trying to figure out like what are these mechanics. And so we said like, okay, well, let's kind of go wide prototyping. And one of the first kind of big lessons that we learned, and this is separate from VR, just as a small game studio, when you go into like wide prototyping phase, it on one hand feels really good to like be able to go and experiment with a bunch of new wild ideas and try out a bunch of mechanics, and it's very green pasture. There's tons of new stuff you can try, but in practice, it's very easy to make enough rope to hang yourself with, because you have five different people find five wildly different ideas, and they're not all going to make it into the game realistically, because chances are people have features that they're excited about, but they may not fit necessarily the game you're making. And so we ended up making a lot of cool prototypes, but they're for like five different games. And so there's sort of this demoralizing thing that happens where you're like, hey, you worked on this thing, but like that's actually not what we're doing, and throw it out. And you're like, oh, like it feels bad to like I'd spent all this time working on it, and now we're not touching it. Like it was cool to get to work on it, but so there's that. And then just a small company with not a ton of runway, and so like you've burned some time there. And so we spent 6 months trying out a bunch of stuff. We did we it wasn't necessary to do the prototyping, but the thing we were trying to in that find the fun phase. In that case, it was, and then find the fun, it was more like find the comfort, and try a bunch of different mechanics. And it was necessary to do some of that, but we were trying to be a little too egalitarian. I think it's good to be egalitarian in a sense in small studios, and if everyone feel like they have an opportunity to contribute. But when you don't have any like high level creative person saying this is where we're trying to head to, it's very easy to paint yourself into this corner. And so we hit that problem. So we spent a bunch of time doing that and then throwing out a bunch of work. That was not good for just the budget. And then the other big thing that happened was um, uh, trying to figure out, once we had settled on, like I said, we can't do all these things. We're just going to do the road locomotion. How do we make this jumping and traversing and speed stuff feel comfortable? Once we knew the kind of game we're making, it was easier to start iterating on filing off the rough edges, but it was still a lot of work. We spent easily a year and a half just trying to make and learn a bunch of things about anticipation. So like when you're going to jump off of a ramp, and land, it turns out if you like know like, hey, we're like half a second from hitting the ground, slowing you down a little bit and playing anticipatory like jetpack sound. At the time we were playing with the PSVR 2, and it had a rumble pack in the headset, which at first like, why on earth would you want rumble in the headset? But it turns out it's really cool for anticipating bumps. And so if you do like a little light buzz, it's like a bass speaker, basically, is what it feels like, because it's like a 20 hertz rumble pack. And so it's cool for like giving your brain that sensation of like, hey, we're coming down on a landing. That was really cool. The other big thing was realizing, hey, rather than like falling at like in a standard parabolic arc off of ramp. If you do a parabolic upward motion, but then once you go over the hump of it, if you kind of fall into a flat glide, that feels great. And so we sort of switched that because we had a person on the team who was really sensitive to the falling motion, and noticed once you kind of started falling at a fixed rate, that felt good, which is cool. But we figured that out a little late because when you're falling at that fixed rate, it means your fall time goes a lot longer. And so, we had to like kind of redesign a lot of the levels to accommodate these jumps that were going to take that falling
Elongate
direction.
it.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's kind of sad because like we got through that, and it took a long time. Anytime you're doing any new locomotion or any kind of new interaction in VR, it just takes a long time to settle on something that is right. And so that's why I think it's really, if you're going to do a VR game, play other VR games first, because definitely, look, it's true of any game, right? Like look at what other people have done, solved it, don't resolve it, a problem that's already been solved already. But getting that right, it took a while. And then right as we were like saying, cool, we know the game we're making, we know how to make this feel good, then it got canceled just because there was a priority shift in the publisher at the time, when they said, we're not doing a bunch of the indie games anymore, we're doing big licensed IP games, and your game's cut. So that was a real bummer. But we did learn a lot about how to approach that problem of more aggressive locomotion. And we learned a lot about how do we as a studio do that prototyping phase. And so we'd switched to a more formal process after that of saying like, hey, we actually had a team we had spun up about trying to do prototyping and saying, hey, start off, when you're doing a small prototype, don't have like 10 people in it, have like 3 initially. When you're going in there, like have biz dev involved in this thing and say like, hey, what's the market we're trying to serve, for this thing? And you don't have to have it completely solved, but it's like, what's the audience you're trying to go for? And what are the features you have? So if you're doing prototypes, you should be trying to like head in that direction. So even if you don't necessarily have a strong creative vision, like what should we be trying to point toward in there? And have it, time bound. Say like, we're trying to do this in like 6 months or 3 months or whatever. And given that artificial constraint helps actually drive creativity in a good way, I think, because you're like, we're trying to hit this goal. It's like a game jam in a way, you're just like, say, here's this specific time bound, here's this theme you're trying to hit, winnow it down in that time period. And so the combination of things really help make the prototype pitching thing feel good, and people didn't feel like they were stuck endlessly prototyping. It's like, we're going to make this pitch, we're going to try this idea out, we're going to ship this one thing, and then if we're lucky, we get to make that as a pitch to a publisher, and if not, we put it in the can and we can pick it back up later, and there's some cool ideas that we learned that we can maybe reuse for other stuff.
Yeah, it's funny because it sounds similar to stuff when having to design for some mobile game free to play game stuff. It was a lot of like you have these kind of constraints that you have to work with, and we have very clear like KPIs, clear metrics to aim for. And then you're within this realm, and so it became really easy to come up with stuff because everything was so clear. It's like, oh, you can only design on this axis, and so everything actually ended up being easier to design for, which is interesting, because when you have like too much, then it kind of goes all over the place and there's no focus. So
yeah, I feel like we are relearning a lot of lessons from mobile game devs in the VR space, and in fact, a lot of the early VR friends were from the mobile space, and who did appreciate those lessons and knew the market they're trying to hit, or trying to like have very tight experiences that worked for that early day where people were doing small demos rather than they're like VR mobile games basically.
Yeah, I also like that you kind of touched upon like, oh, well, it took time, but like you bank all of that stuff like for like you're gonna stay together at the studio and you learn together, and like your future projects are gonna reflect all those things that you've learned. So it's not really a waste of time, even though it feels like it was a time thing. It's more like leveling up secretly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, to your point, what I mentioned, the wasted initial month trying a bunch of prototypes, but what we did also find too was that some people have a mechanic they're excited about, and then they feel like because of the particular game they're doing the demo for, they sort of have to pigeonhole it into this theme, to make it work. But it's like, well, we're going to throw this out, but they still are excited about that mechanic, and that often ends up getting reused elsewhere because they're like, that same person still working in the studio is still excited about that thing, and they find a new way to reuse it. So yeah, absolutely.
That's great. It's funny. I've worked on merge games, and then I got away from merge games, and I was like, okay, I'm no longer doing merge, but it keeps creeping back in into games that
Yep,
I'm
yep.
working on. It's really funny. It's like,
Yeah.
oh, maybe I am the merge person because that is my
Yeah,
mechanic.
exactly.
I'm
Exactly.
like, it's back. It came back for me.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah,
Yes. Yeah.
I wanted to talk a little bit more about decisions in VR. So, when developing for multiple VR platforms, how do you decide between maximizing portability versus leveraging specific platform features?
Oh man, that is a great question. Yeah, and it's hard. It so often, we depending on the timeline, are forced to like, you know, um, in order to be stable, having to ship on the most number of platforms, so being maximally portable, so trying to like do minimum viable or the tightest constraint, trying to design your game around what's the least flexible controller. It's specifically what I'm thinking about, like in Moss One, we originally were shipping on PSVR and Steam, but because we had to support the DualShock controller back then, which just had the little light bar in front, you had effectively one hand, and so it was possible to add a second hand later in that game, but we had to like say this game, all the puzzles have to work, assuming you're only interacting with one hand. So designing with that initial constraint in that time frame, um, and so for us, we just didn't. Our feeling was, let's design the game around whatever the most restrictive controller set is early on, and then we're going to get a chance to port these things to other platforms, and we can start adding embellishments. We can't go back and change the puzzles, later, but we can add, it's always easy to turn up the graphical knobs, increase the resolution, add new particle effects. That's the thing on platforms that support, better rendering. It was usually the controller stuff. Fortunately, across the board early on, haptics generally were good across, or there's enough that you didn't have to do, you had to like adjust strengths and things for that across the platforms, but like generally all stuff we wanted to have like haptic feedback for when you touch an interactive device and stuff like that, that generally worked across all. But it was early on, the notion that you'd have two hands was a challenge. um, uh, since then, it's sort of become standardized that everybody has two-handed controllers with basically the same set of buttons. um, oh yeah, the thumbsticks, man, the great thumbstick wars. For a long time, um, people, there was this debate about whether touchpads were the future. I won't say who, but there was an engineer at another software company that said that people will look back on. I'm going to misquote it, but basically, he felt like touchpads were the future, and that people look back at the thumbstick as like the inferior version of touchpads for that. And they are more flexible in a certain way, but they lack some of the haptic stimulus that you get with tactile, like spring. Like you put your thumb down, if your thumb is centered or not when you're on a thumbstick, because you feel the tension of the spring of the stick. How far you've deflected it because you can feel that in the tension of the stick. It feels good to move that around. You can do some haptic feedback on a touchpad, but then that distracts from the haptic feedback of the game. You're feeling taps. Is it the taps because the game's trying to tell me something, or it's taps because you're trying to simulate a spring in a thumbstick? Um, so that's sort of a funny narrow relic in time when trying to port to the Vive controllers. These days, everyone's sort of settled on, yes, we'll have, even Meta too for a long time was like, do we want to have thumbsticks or not? Um, so if anytime you want to have any kind of like locomotion, I feel like any game dev will tell you like, yes, please let us have thumbsticks. Now the interesting interaction challenge is about whether or not to have controllers at all or use hands. There's enough compute power for machine learning to do pretty good hand tracking. And so there's a question about, can you lower friction by making so you have to worry about controllers, and just like, I just put the headset on and I'm just using my hands. I can do pinch interactions to grab things. If I have eye tracking, I can use gaze to help select things. But there's some big trade-offs about that, and so we're debating about right now, and this is literally a thing for grass pickers having to worry about. You could say like, hey, we're going to do least common denominator and only support hands, no controllers at all. We didn't want to do that though, because there's enough really big important differences between the two. That we do want to support both. But the one of the big things is that when you don't have a button to press, the reliability of a click is both more latent. It's very small, but like when you do this pinch gesture, it's not going to be quite as quick as a button press on a controller, and the reliability is lower. On a headset like the Apple Vision Pro, it's shockingly good because they've done a ton of work to try to improve that, but it's like 98% good, versus like the 100% you get from a button. And misclicks feel so bad. It's like when you have a misclick at just exactly the wrong moment in a game, particularly an action game, you're just like, you remember that. And so it's a challenge to make a game that is more tolerant, and trying to just like, do we dial back the intensity of our gameplay because we're trying to be a little more responsive to that. And then separately, with the pinching, camera in the front of the headset can see this pinch really well, but when you turn your hand like this, suddenly it's harder for it to tell. And I'm surprised how well like the Apple Vision Pro handles this. But you can even have situations where like you think this isn't a pinch, and I haven't pinched yet, but when I rotate, now suddenly the camera's like, oh, you're pinching now, because it looks like the fingers are touching, but they're not.
Yeah.
So there's lots of challenges like that. And then of course, now you have one button, right? You can try to do other fingers, but the different headsets support that to varying degrees. You can try to do it yourself, but it just takes a ton of work in getting that finger detection stuff correct.
So interesting.
Yeah.
I know, like
And then
a long
yeah.
time ago, I tested out like gloves that like let you type, and they actually worked really well, but then they just kind of died off, and I never saw them again. But it's interesting. We keep wanting to bring hands back in, but it's not quite there yet.
Yeah, they're really cool because I want you can get more expressivity in the kind of gestures you're doing, but it's a ton of work in I mean, this is the same problem we had too with just getting position tracked hands, right? Like when you have this soupy input, it's continuous. How do you get discrete game signals out of it in the right way? And in MOS, it's like we're just gonna have these constrained puzzle devices that move along fixed tracks or whatever, and so you can make that work. We want discrete button inputs with hands. It's tricky, and so how do you lean into
it
that in your
seems
game
like
design?
it depends on the type of game too, because there's some games that aren't as action based. So if it's like a game about petting dogs or cats, like you probably don't need as much. And so probably an experience like that would be fine. But yeah, action games would be frustrating. I can imagine that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime to your point, like if you want to lean into the interactions, picking up the touching devices, interacting with animals or pets is a great example. Batman did a bunch of cool stuff with even though they weren't using the hand tracking in that, they still had modeled hands, and so they wanted to make it so like all the collision in the environment was like super accurate, so you could like run your hands across bars, but it's just feel a little weird, like Batman stroking this prison cell bar.
That's so funny. I think I just want a game where you do silly interactions and you're just like,
yeah. You want the pressure washer simulator, but for like hand washing.
Yeah,
so there's a game there. Yeah,
like
yeah.
Handshake simulator.
Yeah. That would be. That's a good idea. That would be a lot of fun. Future game jam plan.
Like as long as there's like humor in it, it's fine. Like when you have humor, you can have less precision.
Absolutely. I mean, I feel like Surgeon Simulator leaned into that early on in the VR game days, because it was like they knew that like there's all these janky problems you had with what happens when one object interpenetrates with another object. In a confined space, it's a collision nightmare. Trying to get your hands to interact and touch. It's like let there be chaos, and the chaos is fun. And you want to have a rib cage rattling around inside the chest and then pop out. It's like that's funny. It's okay.
Yeah.
And another like game that's supposed to be like really cinematically rigid and tonally correct, and it's like that's like a nightmare to deal with. But if you're like, no, embrace the chaos, that's great.
Yeah. Or maybe even like a horror game, like if you're like fumbling, like that adds to it. My friend made like a horror game where like all the controls were just terrible, but it actually added to my fear, because I was like, oh, good idea. Which button do I press?
So the experience of like losing your shoes, or you're running or dropping the car keys. Absolutely. It's a co-op horror game.
Yeah. You're like, no, just pick up the keys. Yeah.
Someone needs to do like a horror themed version of WarioWare. And if you're playing all the silly little mini games or whatever, where like
Yeah.
it's like pluck the
Oh, that
nose
would
hair or
be
whatever,
perfect.
yeah, yeah.
That would be perfect. Jeff and I were talking about we was designing this mini game where you're like a cake decorator at like a deli, not a deli, but like a bakery in like
Mm-hmm.
a store, and you're
Mm-hmm.
decorating the cake, but it's like a timing thing, and if you miss it,
Doing the sheet
then
cakes.
you like write happy birthday instead of like happy birthday, and then like and I was like, this is actually really fun to mess up on.
That would be incredible. You do like Cake Rex the game. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're giving me flashbacks. So early in my career, one of the games I worked on, uh, we were at this small studio called Oberon, and they got licensed to do for Microsoft some games for Windows Vista. And one of them was this kids cake making game called Comfy Cakes as part of this Purple Place game. Any young kids that were stuck playing Windows Vista games were stuck dealing
Oh,
with the horror
Vista.
of the Purple Chef. That was my fault.
I have to hunt this down now.
Yeah.
Comfy cakes. Okay, I'm gonna
Comfy
write that
Cakes.
down. Comfy cakes. I wonder if I can like even access it. I'm gonna find it.
I think it's some YouTube, but there's a weird cult following I discovered recently. Some people were like fondly remembering that from their childhood. I'm like, why would you fondly remember this game? We used to joke about it. It was like cake, forced, cake factory, because like it wasn't really a fun game to play. You just like we're having to like mechanically play out this cake stamping. Like why are we making children do this?
It sounds fun to me. I'm gonna try it. I wanna
Yeah.
like I wanna have a day where we all just like play the worst of our
Oh yeah.
the worst of our
Oh
projects. Like,
yeah.
look at this.
It's a good
Yeah.
idea. Should call it Shame Jam.
Shame Jam. I love that. I'm stealing that. It's gonna be a shame jam. You're gonna see it pop up. That's what we're doing now.
We've got some golden gems I can forward.
Well, it's about time to wrap up, but I want to
Mm,
ask you one final question.
mm.
Do you have any advice for anyone who's looking to work in or start indie VR studio?
Mm, yeah. I mean, I think fortunately these days, as far as the tooling and stuff that's available now, I think it is way more accessible than it's ever been. So I would recommend, pick up an Oculus Quest 3. I think these days, do whatever you can to prototype quickly. Unity or Unreal, a perfectly fine choice. I would say it is the case. It seems like these days that the market tends to be skewing younger than historically has been. And so, not to say that you have to strictly look at that, but I think it's worth considering that, even if you might not be thinking about making games for younger people. I think that there's a lot of strength and opportunity in games that are social. And so, thinking about that, whether that be two-player co-op versus like a larger space, it's obviously more work to do a large, online game. But think ones that lean into that. There are the platforms now are all sort of pushing the ability to support hand tracking. You don't have to do it, but I think it's worth it because it's a lot of work to get that right. I would say if you're going to do hand tracking, figure out one or two like gestures or mechanics that feel really good, polish those up. Don't try to like go crazy on doing a fully realistic hand simulation for stuff, but just find like, 3 to 5 like really good things that you can polish up and then use those as the core to build the rest of your interactions. And I would say there's some interesting opportunity for mixed reality pass-through now. The headsets now are starting to get the ability to see the outside world and place objects on top of things. So you have to do a game about that, but there's a lot of exciting opportunity for tabletop experiences, simple simulations like that, the other small sandbox toys. So there's some cool areas to experiment with that. So I say try that and consider it because platforms are trying to push that right now. And yeah, I'd say the biggest thing overall is don't go crazy on trying to invent like 20 different interactions in your game because every interaction you do takes 6 months to get right. And so pick a couple and build the core of your game out of that.
That's great advice. That's such a huge package of advice that you gave there. It's great. You went above and beyond. Okay, so thank you so much for
My
joining us
pleasure.
today as our guest.
Thanks for having me.
And yeah, I just want to give you a big thanks, and
Yeah,
it was a pleasure.
yeah,
And
pleasure as well.
that concludes our episode of the Game Dev Local Podcast. Thank you for
Woo!
joining us.
Yay! Excellent.